Our next speaker served as the United States Ambassador to the United Nations for 2 years under George W. Bush. He's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a frequent commentator on Fox News. When I think of John Bolton, I think of the man who, as soon as Barack Obama started his apology tour, this man stood up and said, that president is not on the American team. He's on the American team. John Bolton works hard to promote America's interests internationally. And I'm really looking forward to what he has to say today. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador John Bolton.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here today, and appreciate all of you being here today, because this really is the beginning of a very consequential decision for New Hampshire and for the country. This presidential election is, I think, going to be the most important we've seen in a long time. People say it every 4 years. Happens to be true this time. And I think it's especially true with respect to our country's national security and the threats we face around the world. So I'd like to talk to you, if I may, about what I think the state of the world is, why we got that way, and why your unique responsibility in New Hampshire gives you the potential to have such an enormous impact on the next president, and the qualities that I would suggest you look for the person in that job. With a lot of people running, there are going to be a lot of statements being made. I want to focus on what I think is the core issue. So let me start with a brief discussion of the state of the world. And I will be open to questions to hear your thoughts on this when I finish. So I'm not going to cover everything because the list of problems is too long. But I think it's important to put this presidential decision in context. And the world that the United States faces today is a world filled with threats and challenges. Filled with threats and challenges that have grown over the past 6 years, that are now more dangerous, more acute, more imminent than they were before Barack Obama became president, and which over the course of the next 2 years are going to get worse. Because our adversaries can read a calendar just as effectively as we can. They know there's less than 2 years of this weak and feckless and inattentive president in the White House, and they're going to try and take advantage of it. But let's be clear. The problem is not simply the philosophy or the background of Barack Obama. The problem is that his philosophy of national security is thoroughly embedded in the Democratic Party. America used to have two political parties that believed in a strong American foreign and defense policy. That's no longer true. There is no Scoop Jackson wing of the Democratic Party anymore. There isn't even a Joe Lieberman wing of the Democratic Party anymore. We are the only alternative for people who believe that a strong American presence in the world is necessary to sustain our way of life. And the corollary of that is true as well. You can't have a strong American presence in the world without a strong domestic economy. Now, there are some people, even in our party, who don't understand that. But I think they're a distinct minority. I think in the Republican Party, it's the isolationists who are isolated. And I think you in New Hampshire can prove that next year. But the world itself is moving beyond our control, because we have an administration that won't defend our interest, won't protect our allies, won't stand up to our adversaries. Let's just take a quick look. In Europe, we said in 1945 that never again would military force be allowed to change international borders on that continent. And yet today, Vladimir Putin's Russia is using military force on the continent of Europe to change international boundaries. This sends fear through American allies in Eastern and Central Europe. It sends a signal around the world that America is not prepared to defend its friends and its interest in the heartland of Europe. And the next phase may come when Vladimir Putin tests this administration, tests the theories that Hillary Clinton put into play when she announced the famous reset button with Russia. Putin will test again, and we'll see if, in fact, he's able to damage the NATO alliance itself, something that we have relied upon for over 60 years. But it's not just the threat in Eastern and Central Europe that's represented by Putin's aggressive behavior or America's weak response. Nobody is paying more attention to the crisis in Ukraine and what may come next than the authoritarian leaders in Beijing, who have made assertive, belligerent territorial claims around the periphery of China. They have done what they think they need to do to begin to turn the South China Sea from an international waterway into a Chinese lake. Now, that may seem to be a long way away, but every barrel of oil that goes from the Middle East to Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and the countries of Southeast Asia goes through the South China Sea. If that waterway comes under the control of China, key trading partners of the United States will find China with their hands around their economic throat. And this is the kind of assertion of power, contrary to American interest, that our president simply pays no attention to. The threat of international terrorism, which the president doesn't even want to address as an attack on the United States, he wants to treat it as a law enforcement matter. The threat of international terrorism has grown substantially during his 6 years in office. We see it as the Middle East descends from a crisis in Libya, a crisis in Iraq, a crisis in Yemen, descends into chaos. And this is not a threat that's distant from the United States simply because it's geographically remote. It's a threat we saw last year, touched people in this room when Americans were beheaded by ISIS. We saw it 2 years ago at the Boston Marathon, next door in Massachusetts. I certainly felt it then. My wife Gretchen, who's here today, was running in the Boston Marathon that year and will be running again this Monday because she, like all the marathoners, is not going to be deterred by this threat of terrorism. But I'm sure many of you in this room had friends or relatives running in the marathon. This is a real and imminent and direct threat to the United States that the president simply won't address. And we can see that this threat is being made far worse by the weakness of the American and the Western response. We've seen the attacks in Paris against the satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo. We've seen the attack on the kosher grocery store in Paris. We've seen the attacks in Copenhagen. We've seen further beheadings of Yazidis and Coptic Christians in Libya. There isn't any doubt that this ideological threat that we face is serious and growing. In Africa, Boko Haram is sweeping across northern Nigeria. It's declared its allegiance to the ISIS caliphate. And what is our response? There is no response. Our friends in the Middle East are saying the United States has abdicated. They won't stand up against this threat. And they're extremely worried, as we see in Yemen today. Again, it may seem to be a distant country, but it now has the dubious distinction of hosting both al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and the al-Houthi coalition, which is a surrogate for the state sponsors of terrorism in Iran. It is, I'm afraid to say, only a matter of time before some worse tragedy befalls us in the United States. And we will have our own administration largely to blame. And then, worst of all, we see the Obama administration engaging in what I believe is the most serious act of appeasement by an American president in history in the negotiation of this deal with Iran over its nuclear weapons program. We have made concession after concession to a regime that, after all, is a state sponsor of terrorism. It's been the central banker of international terrorism since 1979. It has deliberately targeted and killed Americans for decades, going back to the bombing of the Marine barracks in Lebanon in 1983 during the Reagan administration, carried out by a predecessor of the terrorist group Hezbollah, with Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps officers on the scene in Beirut, directing and watching as that truck full of explosives killed over 250 American Marines. The Iranians armed and equipped Shia terrorists in Iraq who attacked Americans. They've armed and equipped the Taliban in Afghanistan to kill Americans. So when the Ayatollah Khamenei and the other mullahs say death to America, that's not a prediction, that's a reality. And what is our president doing? He is negotiating with people whose word you cannot trust. I don't care whether we sign a deal with Iran on the nuclear weapons program or not, they're not going to abide by it. They haven't abided by any commitment they've ever made on the nuclear front. They're not going to give up a 30-year-long search for nuclear weapons. This may postpone the crisis until after the president leaves office, but it will not postpone the threat of a nuclear Iran, nor will it postpone the inevitable further proliferation of nuclear weapons to Saudi Arabia, to Egypt, to Turkey, and to others. This is what proliferation is all about. This is why it's so important to stop Iran before it gets nuclear weapons. Something that the president's policy is not only failing to do, it's accelerating the nuclear arms race in the Middle East. And in conjunction with that, while the president makes concessions to Iran, makes cessions to the Castro regime in Cuba, it snubs, indeed, it insults the democratically elected leader of our firmest ally in the Middle East, the State of Israel, which fears a nuclear Iran as we do, but with even more reason. Israel is a small country, a half a dozen nuclear weapons, and it would face what now deceased Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon called a nuclear holocaust. Our Arab friends in the region are beside themselves. They don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons any more than we do or Israel does. They know they can't stop Iran. And they've watched as the president has made a laughingstock of his commitment that all options are on the table. The Iranians don't believe that. The Israelis don't believe it. The Arabs don't believe it. I tell you, ladies and gentlemen, the president doesn't believe it. And it shows. And as if anybody needed any proof of how weak and feckless we are, look at what Vladimir Putin did on Monday, signing a decree that after 5 years of holding it up will allow the transfer of a very sophisticated anti-aircraft defense system to Iran that will effectively make it immune from attack by Israel and will dramatically increase the difficulty for any other country, including the United States, to prevent it from getting nuclear weapons. This is as clear an example, a laboratory demonstration of how to put a thumb in somebody's eye that you get in international politics. And it's the Russian leadership putting its thumb in our eye. Now, that's the world that we face, in part. I could go on. That's the world we face now, and as I said, it will get worse over the next 2 years. So this, to me, underlines in the most graphic, emphatic way why the decision that we as Republicans make in picking our next president is so important. There are many issues that concern us. The state of the economy, Obamacare, immigration, education. There's a long list of important issues. But let's be clear. The principal responsibility of the President of the United States is to protect the country. If the President fails at that responsibility, every other issue falls away. We have seen the result of a president who doesn't fulfill that responsibility. And as we know that that is the major task of the president, it is critical. Whatever other issues concern you, and there are many and they're all valid, whatever other issues concern you, I would suggest respectfully that your first decision has to be whether the candidate understands and is capable of dealing with the rest of the world to protect the country. That's the central issue. Now, what does that mean in terms of the presidential candidates? And I know what the political conventional wisdom is. I know what they say about foreign policy not being important to people. It's too distant from their daily lives. It doesn't matter in politics. I give a lot more credit to the American people than the commentators. You know as well as I do that this is the central issue. So that as you evaluate people as they come through New Hampshire, and remembering what an absolutely critical role New Hampshire has. You know, if you're ever going to get a would-be president to pay attention to the people, it's when they come through here. It's not whether the candidates can read a well-crafted, eloquent speech, maybe from a teleprompter, maybe not. It's not whether they can read speeches. It's not whether they can have a couple paragraphs in their campaign stump speeches. You need someone who understands in his or her gut that the most important thing they do is protect the country. And you'll see it in the town halls and in your living rooms and in the restaurants where they come while you're trying to have lunch or dinner. That's what you need to see. Do they feel it in their gut? Not just do they say it, but do they understand it and do they mean it? I think the president should wake up every morning and think as his or her first thought, what threat does the United States face today? That's what a president should think. That's what you should look at. And I think it will be good politics in 2016. I think it's critical for the country. And to underline that, let's be clear. Everybody tells us that whoever we nominate will face Hillary Clinton. Now, I want to say I do think I have a special relationship with Hillary. She and her husband were a year ahead of me in law school down in New Haven. I like to say I've been burdened with them 20 years longer than the rest of the country. And I'll tell you something else. I think the way somebody is in law school or grad school or that time of life is pretty much the way they are throughout the rest of their adulthood. And I'll tell you something. Back in law school, Hillary was a radical, and she's a radical today. She will be Obama's third term, domestically and internationally. She doesn't have to work in her campaign, such as it is, to get to the left of Elizabeth Warren. She's already there. And so the problems that we've encountered internationally under 8 years of Barack Obama are only going to be worsened by 4 or 8 years of Hillary Clinton. It's not going to get any better. So this is the point over the next several months where we have to avoid repeating the mistakes of 2008 and 2012. We cannot afford to elect an unqualified person to be president. We cannot make this same mistake 3 times in a row. And you are the people who can prevent that from happening. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, I like to say I spread sweetness and light wherever I go. So I assume I've gotten everybody back, got their metabolism going after lunch again. But as I said earlier, I'm happy to answer questions on anything, whether I brought it up or didn't bring it up. Yes, sir? Yeah, we have. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Ambassador. I read an editorial in Investor's Business Daily 2 days ago that scared the crap out of me, talking about an ISIS training camp in southern New Mexico. Why are we just hearing about this now? And my concern is our porous border letting these terrorists in?
Yeah, look, I think ISIS has spread far and wide. I think our inattention to it over a sustained period is going to come back to bite us. And I don't think there's any question but the terrorists, whether they're ISIS or others, fully understand that if you want to get into the United States, the place to do it is across the Mexican border. Look, even the Obama administration 2 years ago indicted senior officials of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps for conspiring to kill the Saudi Arabian ambassador to the United States in the streets of Washington by coming across the Mexican border using human traffickers or drug traffickers. So that's an indication that the whole world knows the way to come into the United States. And I tell you, as Iran gets closer to a nuclear weapon, North Korea contemplates selling nuclear weapons to terrorist groups. They don't need ballistic missiles. That's certainly one way to deliver them. But they can they can break them up, give them to terrorists, slip them across the border, put them in a pickup truck, and drive into any American city. So this is not a hypothetical risk at all. Yeah, in the back there, sir, with the red tie. The fellow with the red tie, sorry. Should have worn a red tie.
Ambassador, why is it the case that both Britain and France seem to be going along with this Iranian deal?
Well, I can tell you from years of negotiating with the Brits and the French and the Germans on this question of Iran that they have long been motivated by the idea that they could get Iran basically to give up its nuclear weapons program. And I think now they've been at it for 12 plus years. That's why when people say, well, why don't you just give the negotiations a little bit more time to play out? We've been talking directly or indirectly to the regime in Tehran for 12 years. You know, how long does it take Iran to convince us that this is a peaceful program? But I tell you, when the British and the French and the Germans started in 2003, over my objections, this was one of my failures at the State Department, they said, look, our bottom line is when this deal is done, Iran will have no uranium enrichment capability. And they insisted that as a precondition even to negotiate, that Iran suspend its uranium enrichment activities. Now, the Iranians said, sure, we'll suspend our activities, and then they lied about it and continued research and development. The Europeans kept negotiating, but they still insisted, and we embodied it in Security Council resolutions, that there be no uranium enrichment activities. The Obama administration has taken a position weaker than the UN Security Council. I mean, just fashion on that for a minute. Weaker than the position the Russians and the Chinese took 8 years ago. And I think, as I say, I think they know Obama's going to cut this deal. The country that stood up more against it in the negotiations than any others has been France. I mean, do you realize now the only thing that's saving us from this deal, possibly, is a socialist French government? I mean, I don't know what else you need to know about this deal and how bad it's going to be. Yes, sir.
Excuse me.
No, over there, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
I picked somebody with a blue tie this time.
Equal rights for blue ties. Good to see you back in New Hampshire. I've been reading some
I'm very glad to be back.
Good. I've been reading some things about ISIL, and particularly that they are not just, rabid terrorists, but very specifically are operating on their understanding of parts of the Quran, and particularly their leader, Abu Baghdadi, I think, has declared establishment of a caliphate. In doing so, that obliges all believing Muslims wherever to move there to forswear allegiance to any other entity, any government, and last but not least, to expand the caliphate by conquest, and its purpose also, and they do this for salvation, is to kill any apostates and subjugate or kill any non-believers. So that says to me that this is not just random stuff. This is
Right.
religious-fueled, salvation-generated attempt to expand into all territories on the planet. I want to get your comments on that.
Sure. Look, what we're facing here is a political ideology. It stems from a particular religion, but it's a politicized form of that religion. And it's a reflection of the merger of church and state in that particular view. I think if we continue to look at the threat of international terrorism simply as a series of random acts, or as the president says, sort of crime that mayors deal with in municipalities, you're never going to eliminate crime entirely, you completely miss the point. There are a lot of varieties of this ideology. There's Al-Qaeda, there's ISIS, there's Boko Haram. There will be others as well. It's like Europe after World War I, when various forms of communist revolutions sprang up in different countries. Anarchism was abroad. And what eventually happened when it all shook out was that the Soviet Union had been formed as a communist nation. I don't think we are yet anywhere near the end of the threat of radical Islamicism. And I think the weakness of our response, our inability to understand that we're facing an ideology, is crippling to us. In the 20th century, we were able to understand that we faced the ideology of fascism and Nazism. We understood the ideology of communism. We were able to defeat both of them. We can defeat radical Islam, but we can't defeat it if, as the president acts, that we don't acknowledge that it exists and understand it for what it is. So I think that's absolutely critical to developing an effective strategy against it. And every day that goes by allows this hostile ideology to take more root. ISIS today controls territory in what used to be the states of Iraq and Syria, equivalent to the size of Great Britain. Now, it's true, a lot of it's sand, and you wouldn't particularly want to live there, but it's a big territory. They are forming a new state. Other states in the Middle East have disintegrated entirely, like Libya, and where terrorists have taken root. And every day that goes by, the situation deteriorates further. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
What do you think about the terror from within? Obama himself, where he's putting Muslims in Homeland Security, he's taking all of our battleships in one spot when they should be all over everywhere else. He's smuggling the Muslim Brotherhood into the White House. And I've also heard that he's amassing his own tanks and assault weapons and trying to get rid of our gun control and everything else.
Well,
do you think and getting the 4 and 5 star generals, do you think that he's actually planning, since a country becomes bankrupt and he's trying to do that, a dictator always comes in,
The answer is no, actually. Look, I think there are a lot of theories about what motivates the president. Here's mine. It's really very straightforward. He went to Columbia and Harvard Law School. I mean, really, that pretty much tells you where he got it, and Hillary went through the same thing. I think it's important to understand that although Obama is the embodiment of the problem, he's not the only problem. Let me give you an example. In 1988, George H.W. Bush, in whose administration I was proud to serve, said of his opponent, Michael Dukakis, your neighbor as governor of Massachusetts once, Bush said of Dukakis, he sees the United States as just another pleasant country somewhere out there on the UN roll call between Albania and Zimbabwe. Just another country. That's Barack Obama. It's the same philosophy, and that's not a philosophy I think should be running the country. Yes, sir, in the back.
And this will be the last question, so.
And here's a man with no tie. By God, I do not discriminate.
Hello, Ambassador. The question I have is, how do you feel about Vladimir Putin when he said the conditions that led the Russians to go into Crimea on behalf of the ethnic Russians in Crimea also exist in the Baltic states?
Yeah.
And I think that was a threat to the Baltic states. And then he also said that he opposes NATO to install any air defenses or any equipment into the Baltic states, or even the conducting of exercises in the Baltic states.
Yeah. Look, this is a direct threat by Putin. It's a direct challenge to the NATO alliance. He thinks that our response could well be weak. It's worth the experiment from his point of view to challenge us over the territory of a NATO member like the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania. If he gets resistance, he can pull back easily. If he doesn't meet resistance, he'll move forward because he sees the opportunity to shatter the NATO alliance. I know Putin. I've negotiated with him. Everything you see about him being a tough guy is true. This is a man who knows his own mind. He said the last time he was president, the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And by that, he means to reestablish Russian hegemony in the space of the former Soviet Union. And I think he sees the path open before him. And that's why he's going to proceed until he meets resistance. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. You have a very important choice ahead of you. Thank you.